On the church calendar of the Revised Common Lectionary today is known as the Ascension of the Lord, occurring 40 days after Easter. The 40 days is based on the reference in Acts where Luke says that after his suffering, Jesus presented himself alive to the apostles, appearing to them 40 days and speaking about the kingdom of God. 40 days is a symbolic number corresponding with Jesus' testing in the wilderness. Now, some churches who follow the church calendar more rigidly than we do here will observe Ascension Day this coming Sunday, and one of the scriptural readings for the Ascension of the Lord is Acts 1 through 11. Luke says that as the apostles were watching, he was lifted up, and a cloud took him out of their sight. And while the apostles were gazing up toward heaven, two men in white robes stood by them and said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand looking up toward heaven? This Jesus who has been taken up from you into heaven will come in the same way as you saw him go into heaven." Now, there are many Christians today who believe Jesus will come back to the earth physically and visibly. I used to be one of them. But now I read this symbolically. All religious language is symbolical and mystical and mythical language, really. The point that Luke is making is that Jesus came from God and returns to God, as we all will. And Paul makes this point in 1 Corinthians 15 that the resurrection of Jesus constitutes the first fruits of the resurrection of all humanity. So we follow in the train of Jesus. We come from God, we return to God. Now, the life that Jesus had on earth before he was raised, before God raised him, and the life that Jesus now has after being raised by God is fundamentally, at its core, the same kind of life. It's God's life. Resurrection equips Jesus to live in a different dimension, as it will us as well. But it's the same life he had before he was raised. That is, both before and after resurrection, Jesus is sustained and Jesus is changed by God's life. Resurrection represents a different kind of change, but it's the same life. It's the life of God working from within that does the changing. In John 4, Jesus tells the woman of Samaria that God is Spirit. And Spirit is the name that is used throughout our sacred scriptures to designate God at work in our lives and in our world. Spirit is the way of talking about the activity of God. It's the name we use for God to describe God engaging, actively revealing God's self, actively working in this creation and working in humanity. So why Spirit? Why that word? Why that name? Well, it's an appropriate way to describe the invisible working of God. You know, people in the ancient world thought of heaven as a reality that conceals the presence or the abode of God. And naturally, in an age before modern science, they thought of God's abode as being up, as being above the dome of the sky concealing or hiding the abode of God. So Jesus' upward ascension and his mysterious departure and disappearance into the cloud emphasizes, highlights the invisible and hidden nature of Jesus' life in God, in the Spirit. And the life that is in Jesus, the life that motivated Jesus and filled Jesus and compelled Jesus, is the same life that is in us. It's the life of God. God's life, or God's Spirit, is the life within all life. It's what makes us alive. And whether a person is aware of it or not, it is the Spirit of God that sustains his or her life. As Paul says in Acts 17, in his address to the philosophers in Athens, that in God we live, move, and have our existence. In the second creation story, God forms a human being from the dust of the earth, but the human being formed from the dust of the earth does not become alive. The text says a living being, until God breathes into the human being the spirit of life, or the breath of life, which could be also translated as the spirit of life, because in Hebrew thought, breath and spirit often refer to the same thing. So in this sense, all of us have a little bit of God. Without the life of God, or the Spirit of God within us, we would not be alive. God's life sustains human life. It sustains all life. Now, God's life, of course, is hidden and invisible, and it is full of mystery, as the ascension of Jesus symbolizes his ascension into the cloud. And it's like leaven in the dough, and the life that is in the mustard seed. Invisibly, it works and spreads through the entire dough. It slowly and invisibly changes the seed into a tree where birds of the air find shelter. Now, this current flow of God's life, of hidden, immaterial, visible life, is fused with the visible and the material. And it is expressed in blessing and love and grace throughout this world and throughout the universe, really. And this is what we call in the Christian tradition incarnation. The hidden, invisible life of God becomes visible and material through creation, and in particular through human beings. The invisible Spirit expresses herself or himself through flesh and blood. And when we are tuned in, when we are aware, when we are spiritually conscious and attentive, we intentionally cooperate with the Spirit of life in becoming a channel of God's love and grace and blessing to other human beings and to all creation. And when we are cooperating with the Spirit of God, we can sometimes feel and sense that divine love and blessing pulsating within us and being expressed through us. And like Jesus and the Hebrew prophets before him and mystics of all religious traditions, in such times when the Spirit is flowing through us and we are attentive and tuned in and aware and conscious of how we are becoming a channel through whom the blessing and the love of God can flow, in those moments we get a glimpse of the world as it could be. We get a glimpse of what the world would be like when God's will is done on earth as it is in heaven. Now, in Luke's account of the ascension in Acts 1, Luke emphasizes as part of that story God's call and commission upon us as ambassadors of this divine life, as vessels and channels through whom this life can flow. The risen Christ says to the disciples that when the Spirit of life comes upon them, they will be witnesses to this divine power. They will be ambassadors, witnesses, testimonies to the transforming, healing, redeeming, liberating power of Spirit, capital S, Spirit, the Spirit of life. And, it really is inevitable when we are channels of the Spirit that the Spirit speaks through us and works through us in such a way that our lives become a blessing to others. The Spirit always moves us beyond ourselves. Christians today who are refusing to wear masks in public, Christians who are demanding that their churches be open so that they can assemble together, churches that or Christians that are asserting and claiming and demanding their rights in these ways are not living by the Spirit. Because the Spirit always moves us beyond ourselves, beyond our little selves, our ego selves. And Christians who are thinking of themselves, living for themselves, demanding these rights for themselves without thinking about the health and the well-being and the safety and the goodwill of others, cannot be living by the Spirit. God's Spirit leads us beyond ourselves to think about the well-being of others, especially the vulnerable others. As we see time and time again in the proclamations of the Hebrew prophets and in the life of Jesus of Nazareth, who made it very clear that he put a priority on serving, ministering to, healing and liberating the most vulnerable among us. Life lived in the power of Spirit, capital S, Spirit, radiates as blessing and compassion and care for others and care for all of life on this planet and in the universe, really. Brother David Stendhal Rast, who is, I would call a modern-day mystic, he's a Benedictine monk. He's written a lot on gratitude and life in Spirit, life in God. He illustrates this by referencing the Jordan River as it flows down from Mount Hermon in the north, offering its life-giving water to parched soil. I mean, nowhere is this evident or more evident than by the Sea of Galilee, the Lake of Galilee. The shores on the Lake of Galilee are a paradise of gardens and orchards and fields, and its waters are teeming with fish. The life fills the waters, and then the shore and the land around the waters. It's a paradise of life, really. But then the Jordan flows out of the Lake of Galilee, flows in, it flows out, and it meanders down, making its way to the Dead Sea. And what a contrast when you get to the Dead Sea. I mean, the water in the Dead Sea is so salty that that no fish can live in the Dead Sea. Nothing can live in the Dead Sea. It's even unfit for irrigation. And its shores are a barren land. It's a desert, as far as eye can see. The water is so dense with salt that when you get in the water, as a human being, if you get in the water, you float. It's so dense. But the water that flows into the Dead Sea is the same water that flows into the Sea of Galilee. You know, a good person or an evil person has the same life of God within them. You know, the water that flows into the Sea of Galilee flows out again. The Dead Sea does not pass its waters on. It stays in one place and it stagnates. The only way to really experience the Spirit of life is to be in tune to this divine life, the Spirit of love and blessing that is within us, and allow the Spirit of love and blessing to flow through us from within, without, to touch the lives of others. We receive blessing as we give blessings to others. And Brother David Stindl-Rast, from whom I drew this illustration, says that life, or we could say spirit, comes to us from this mysterious, hidden source that we call God. And we experience God. We nurture God's life when we pass it on, when we become carriers and channels of the divine Spirit, passing it on by loving and blessing others. It's like blood coming from the heart and returning to the heart. Stindl-Rast puts it this way. He says that blood keeps on flowing, and if we tune into the bloodstream of blessing, the world comes alive. Blood is alive only as long as it keeps flowing. And this is true also of blessing, he says. A key phrase in there, I think, is the phrase tune in. If we tune in like a radio receiver to this flow of love and life, then the world comes alive. The world vibrates and pulsates with God's love and God's blessing. By tuning in, by becoming aware, by consciously and intentionally cooperating and partnering with this divine life that is within us, with God, with Christ, with the Spirit. Use whatever term you prefer. We vibrate and we radiate the divine love of God, and we become a blessing to others, to other human beings, our sisters and brothers in the human family, and to the non-human world as well, to all created life. Maybe we even become a blessing to God. Now, I want to turn to our church